Hello and welcome to Varn Blog Solo. And we continue our series on the politics that is not one, but we take a detour for a bit. In the first part of this long series of rants, where I want to go in to the more fundamental question of what politics actually is, what political economy actually is there a way to answer those questions? Is the very idea to contest it? I have always gone by the fact that politics is not just violence, although it is that. It is the administration of social conflict through the establishment of the legitimacy of violent force as a mediator, which is justified in some notion of legitimacy and sovereignty. Now, there are all kinds of answers to what makes politics. I started off with On Politics by Alan Ryan because it is kind of the definitive exploration of classical to Christian to early modern to liberal political notions of sovereignty in Europe and in post-European colonies and the settler colonies in the Americas, both in the Anglophone world in specific, but also it applies to some degree to the Spanish-speaking and Portuguese-speaking world as well. And I also went into Graeber and Sahlins' rather idiosyncratic, but still anthropologically justified counter notion that there's always a tension between hierarchy and equality, and that the king serves this function, that this is a nearly universal function once you get settled societies, and in some cases even for Graeber and Sahlins, some hunter-gatherer societies, where equality is made by the sacralization of the king or the advocacy of the king. The more active the king is, the more involved he is, the more sacralized, the more removed and symbolic they are. So for for Sahlins and Graeber, there are meta persons that take up this space. Now that's removed, really far removed in a lot of ways, from what we might call the traditional Marxist and even some socialist notions of what makes up politics. Still about the administration of violence, but what the administration of violence is specifically for is not just the establishment of an institution, but of a maintenance of both social reproduction and the production of social goods. So, how do you get food and distribute it? How do you protect that food? How do you protect that surplus? And how do you maintain and legitimate that situation? And for Marx, there's a pretty clear teleology from primitive communism, which is relatively equal, into settled society, from settled society, kinship bonds in this very direct way, modeled on, patriarchal family norms that develop in regards to agriculture. This is Engels' story anyway. Leads to the development of a state. The state exists to protect the existing hierarchies that make food production possible on scales in a settled society, and the ability to protect that food production, aka how you have a standing militia or army, or even the ability to call one up if you don't have one standing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the Sahlins story and the classical European story from the Mediterranean to the Christendom to the European world to the post-European world and the settler colonies are very different. You can reconcile them with the Marxist notion, but it shouldn't surprise us then that none of these speak to what we might call the social morality that people today recognize as politics and expect to be consistent. Now, I think a lot of the ideological social moralities that people develop aren't consistent within themselves, but that also the average person does not adopt a clear political tribe, and that times will set that in certain directions. Let's take uh, the current situation with the United Healthcare shooter, possibly. I'm not going to name him, not because I think we should be beyond naming him, because he hasn't been tried yet, probably guilty, but looking through his Goodreads, we're talking about a man who seems to have radicalized by Yuval Harari and Ezra Klein, but also read the Unabomber, which I predict will become the art of war for Zoomer radicals and normies, even for pseudo profound insights as gained from a text. But had all kinds of contradictory opinions, was pro Medicare for all, but also pro regulation of porn. Is that actually contradictory? I don't know. Was worried about the declining rate of childbirth, didn't and said things against DEI, but also had very populist concerns in regards to economics, and frankly doesn't appear to meet anyone's standard of right and left wing, although quickly on the internet, just like we saw with the Trump shooter, there's a scattering to categorize him as one or the other. The reality is, and if anyone's read their Gramsci, just shouldn't surprise them, actually. I don't love Gramsci, but he's read about this element of culture, that the oppressed classes, according to Gramsci, often have incoherent, inchoate, and emotive responses. But also, I just want to point out that a lot of our political tribal clusters don't really make sense anyway. Why do you see a bunch of people who argue for human equality but want a state, which is even Lenin defines as something that precludes the idea of classlessness, because the state requires usually a standing army and police force, and it requires hierarchy to set that up. And while you could have some form of governments that didn't have that, we're not talking about total anarchy here. It would take full social mobilization to do. So you would basically have civil protection militias doing police force work. Is that a state in the modern sense or not? Well, that's beyond the simple question of what we can answer today. But I can tell you that expecting a Jim Bro who exists in a contradictory society to have a clear singular ideology seems to me to be weird. But also means that when we try to cast people as having a consistent ideological perspective based off of their media influences, what books they read, etc., that you're often going to get a lot of confusion. I mean, a lot of people act like everyone's a politicized academic, like, me, even though I'm a autodidact post-academic in a way. I no longer work for a university. I'm still in education, but I don't do professional research in that way anymore. I do it for myself or for private projects. But I'm trained in academic research, and I'm trained in trying to be rigorous and do intellectual genealogies and put it out. The thing is, what radicalized that dude is probably the fact he broke his back and was in pain, and was probably getting, I don't know this yet, but probably was tired of dealing with insurance. As a person who had a spouse with cancer and had to deal with insurance, I've had health scares recently myself and had to deal with insurance. Oh, I definitely get it. My stepfather was a man who voted for Ross Perot, who believed in socialized medicine, still believed in socialized medicine. He was a baby boomer of his generation, had the racial attitudes of a Southern baby boomer. During the Obama administration, got over most of those racial attitudes because he was shocked by the implications of a lot of them. Was not a consistent man. There's a core political morality there and a core of civic duty, right? He was in rhetoric a law and order kind of person, throw away the key, if someone murders someone, just if you catch them, take them about, shoot them in the head. He was that kind of guy. And then his children started getting arrested. My point is that we do not live in a coherent society, and a lot of the coherent politics that we see actually aren't. Graeber, guy who is arguing, as we talked about in his anthropological view with Sahlins on kings being innate in humanity, is an anarchist. He also believes in state-centric money, and that state-centric money is a positive view that could be a transitional program to something else. Now, I give Graeber a lot of shit, but Graeber is a deep thinker. But in a superficial level, if you were to scan his ideas and go, this guy's an anarchist, you would be hard-pressed to figure that out. Are these Marxists who are orthodox Marxists who don't revise anything, but have come up with completely new theories of class, not theories of labor aristocracy, which at least is rooted in Engels and has applications in Lenin, but theories of the PMC, which come way later and have nothing to do with Marxist class analysis. They don't. They were an attempt by the Ehrenreichs to reconcile post-Marxist class analysis by C. Wright Mills and by James Burnham with something like a Marxist class analysis, but had no relation to political economy. Because talking about elites as separate from classes is hard for people to do, except almost every liberal you know does it innately. And so do most Marxists or democratic socialists who go back and forth between definitions of class willy-nilly without telling you that they're doing it all the time. Sometimes when the Jacobin writers want to define working class, they define it the same way liberals do, not having a college education and having a job. And sometimes they define it the Marxist way. Are you involved in the production cycle and dependent on the general wage fund? Although some Marxists think it's important that you are productive, and some Marxists point out that that's harder to figure out in any particular instance. And none of it deals with the fact that most people actually exist in our economy in multiple positions at the same time. If you have a 401k, even a lot of blue collar workers do, although I think it's something like 50%, you will quickly discover that you are structurally involved as in an institution that is a structural capitalist making pension fund decisions for yourself. People aren't that consistent. And the only way to get any kind of consistency emerging from the class is two projects. One, and I think this has been overemphasized in the liberal world, developing cultural stories that unify the class. And what Gramsci was doing was not to abandon the working class, but to create the conditions for a working class party to emerge. It was sort of the idea of proletariat, but realizing that proletariat was probably incoherent and that there was some romanticism coming on from the Bolsheviks who were involved in that. For those of you who don't know, proletariat is short for proletarian culture projects. And realized that maybe something like a proletarian culture had to be developed, but this in of itself creates contradictions. You know, Gilles Devey, for all of his flaws, is right that trying to say that we should valorize workers as the means of the way out of capitalism, but also freeze their culture into the way that they are in capitalism leads to some fundamental contradictions. And proletariat in some ways does that. I remember people talking about the radical choices of proletarian tastes, but the thing is, proletarian tastes, while they are bought by proletarians, aren't created by proletarians. They're created by the cultural industry, which is a subsection of capitalism. So is it any surprise that a petite bourgeois guy with a good education and engineering skills, but who read books largely like the books you see in an airport and had an accident would be radicalized in ways that don't map cleanly onto even a right and left populist lens, much less anything else? part of the problem with subcultures as forms of personal identity is people use it to paper over how inconsistent they are. In my own case, if I was to die tomorrow for some crazy thing and be remembered and people were to check out my Goodreads, they would see that I have rated and read all kinds of books that are not left wing, both in fiction and in nonfiction. And I've even given right wing books whose arguments I detest, but that are well made and smart, good reviews as forms of explications of right wing thought. What would you make of that? Given the way the superficial readings of society go today, people might say I was a closet right winger, or that I was a right winger the whole time. Now, I am not one of these people who's super worried about natalism. I do think it is a problem in the short run, but I think it's a problem created by uh, markets feeling like they have to constantly grow with the workforce. This leads to all kinds of contradictions that we're seeing today. But to expect individuals acting out of rage um, to be politically coherent based off their readings is a nerd's point of view of the world. It is not a particularly materialist one. And to expect people to have a coherent ideology when the ideologies on offer aren't coherent anyway, well, that in of itself is a little bit foolish, isn't it? Politics is not about these idea sets or these dogmas that you just accept. Although that's a part of politics, but the way that religious ideologies often function that way, are ideological philosophical sets in general. But it's those things aren't consistent often, and anybody who studies this should know that. So quit being surprised when they aren't. Protect your peace.